Hello and blessings, a beautiful Coven of the Witch Weaver, Sarava and Ashe to you. We are going to be talking today about centering, and I would like to begin with a little story from home. In Brazil, within the practice of Umbanda Macumba, we call centering afirmando a sua cabeça, affirming your head, afirmando, and it means to collect yourself. And you're supposed to afirmar a sua cabeça before you walk into sacred space, and there are processes in order to do this. And I have always rather loved this. In my physical covens, I always introduced these physical processes, things that allowed for the practitioner to disconnect from the mundane and acknowledge the presence of a sacred ritual as it was about to take place. Now, when you think about it, these days, before you begin ritual, you've done so much, and depending on when you choose to do ritual, where you choose to do ritual, you might travel to do ritual on the beach, in which case you're very focused on driving, and you have, been focused on making sure that you've packed everything that you need. Then you get down to the beach, you're focusing on setting up, and then what happens? And then you have to afirmar sua cabeça. You have to release all of that process. You have to call the self into position, into place, call the awareness into the body, be 100% present. So centering then bleeds into mindfulness, which is what we're going to be discussing next week, but I'm specifically focusing on centering in the way that we afirma a cabeça. I cannot practice centering with my eyes open. I close my eyes when I'm calling my self into being. I actually do this. I close my eyes and I call myself, and it's a physical action that meets in the middle, and I sort of I bow and I'm present, and it's something that I do. It's a physical trigger for me to call myself into place, to afirmar minha cabeça. And so when I implemented certain strategies with my physical covens up north, one of the most simplest things ended up being, and this is just a little side note here, I like simple practices because they are sustainable. They stick with you, they're simple, which means they're much more attainable. Rather than rigorous hoop jumping, I like to make everything simple. Once you have 10 simple things, you have a complex ritual. Look at it that way, and don't ever get overwhelmed. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Don't give yourself too many hoops to jump through. It's very simple the way to do these things. And finding the most simple and meaningful processes are going to serve you so well and save you time and make it enjoyable and easy for you to connect with your practice. Now, back to these methods that I employed. One was very simple. When my witches would show up in sacred space, and we would often hold ritual at beaches, in forests. Sometimes we would rotate in people's houses if the weather wasn't great, and we lived in a tropical environment, so there was a lot of monsoon seasons to sort of to try and negotiate, put it that way. And so whenever an individual would arrive, I would be there, and I would have sacred space set up, and I would then smudge or smoke cleanse that person. I would sometimes spritz with a hydrosol, depending on what that individual liked. Asthmatics, they're not fond of having smoke waved in their nose, and people with allergies to specific things, especially airborne particles, don't necessarily like to have certain smokes wafted all over them. But for the most part, the witches that made up part of my covens, they were fine. There were no asthmatics at the time, but I do know from having held open circle rituals that you have to be very careful with this sort of thing. So if you are an asthmatic, for instance, it's something that you may want to avoid, and then use a hydrosol instead. And a hydrosol is just like a little misting spray. And so for the person that likes to smoke cleanse with sage, for instance, you could use sage oil in a misting spray. And for the person that likes to use Palo Santo and sage or rosemary or a blend of, you can do the same thing with oils. They contain the essence as well. So you can go air or you can go water with this type of approach, in other words. So by smoke cleansing or misting the individual when they first arrived, it sort of helps to get them out of that mind of the mundane. I've just driven, or I've just got here, and oh my gosh, the day and work today was, you know, it sort of just helps. It helps to just waft that smoke all around the individual and, you know, from top to toe, and then give them a hug. Now, obviously, you can't yourself give you a hug. Well, you can go like this. You can hold yourself in that place, but it's a moment of a breath where you feel grateful for where you are, where you feel replenished. Okay, I'm doing this for myself. This is sacred. I'm gifting myself a sacred moment. Very simple, like or gifting myself this sacred moment. And then beyond that, honestly, all I would do is ask for the individual to honor the altar. And that required to tap on the ground, to tap on the altar, and to tap on the self. 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. So tap on the ground to acknowledge the grounding, tap on the altar to acknowledge the sacred, and tap on the self to acknowledge the process. And really great. And then sometimes we would ring a bell. If it was a Sabbath, for instance, we would ring a bell to signal to the spirits that we have arrived, or that such and such had arrived. And we then begin to create that beautiful sacred space together as a whole. And there are ways for you to really get into that centering process for yourself. Afirmando a cabeça is something that is taught when you enter into my tradition, for instance, my family's tradition, my roots. You will not have an interaction with spirit if you do not have a centered mind, if you're not mindful in the moment, if you're not centered, grounded, centered, and practicing a state of mindfulness. It's very difficult for spirit to connect with you if you are not 100% focused. And centering yourself is focus. Centering yourself is switching it all off and bringing everything to the now, making sure that you feel that awareness of self, that awareness of your surroundings, and that focus in the moment. And so centering becomes one of the most sacred practices because it does heighten your awareness. And when you are heightened in your awareness, that is when you can start to receive, for lack of a better word, spiritual information. And this can come in the form of, well, I'm not even going to outline that. It can come in so many different forms. It is ridiculous. But only when you are grounded and centered can that take place. And if you've never had interactions, direct interactions with spirit or with the environment, the energies in your biosphere, for instance, to know what elemental presence is there within your biosphere, to understand exactly what the spirits of the land or spirits of place, as is commonly referred to, are saying, or if anyone is watching you, if you have an ancestor close by centering and calling yourself to this place of presence, you can be 100% present in the mundane aspect of ritual, which I don't believe there is too many mundane aspects of ritual, but there is still the moving, there is still the lighting of the candles, there is still those things which are technically mundane, but they're almost a meditation with purpose. And so everything in ritual to me is sacred. And you can have 5-minute ritual and make it really sacred and ground and center by, in that 5 minute. It does not have to be some long, drawn out, elaborate ritual, although they can be incredibly necessary and fun and nourishing. But the idea behind ritual and the idea behind a solid practice within your witchcraft is the basics. These are the foundations: grounding, centering, mindfulness. They are the 3 most important things in my humble opinion. And I say this because it is impossible to craft magic, to work with energy, to communicate with spirits, to your higher self, to understand the presence of deity, to learn to read metaphor and symbolism. It's impossible to do those things if you're not 100% present. If you're just gliding through town and you're not noticing anything and you're in the daydreaming and you're not grounded into the moment, you're going to miss the beautiful tree. You're going to miss the shape and in the clouds. You're going to miss all those details. Your biosphere is constantly throwing information at you, constantly. I go outside and I'm like, oh, I see. Sometimes it's hard and you have to switch yourself off. Sometimes disconnecting can be equally as challenging, especially if you've just had really nourishing experiences and nourishing ritual. It can get very easy to get lost in that space, and it's important to understand balance, and that is what January is all about, sacred balance. So understanding when to practice and then when to disconnect, to return to that place of grounding. So in a ritual, when we're grounding and we're centering, and we're doing so, we're calling in that sense of sacred, then we perform ritual. And then at the end, we center ourselves once more, and then we ground, and we kind of do it in reverse. And then we can, okay, shake it off, like move the limbs, you know, get the body moving. Okay, I feel good, And you can often recognize that practice after a long meditation, for instance, like you're lulled into this peaceful state where you center and you go on a journey and you ground, center, mindfulness, journey, the whole process, right? And then you have to call yourself back to the now. Like you can be really like dreamy and daydreaming, and if you don't ground, if you don't center yourself after that and you don't ground, then you're lightheaded for the rest of the day. And ritual can actually create that feeling of lightheadedness, and it's very easy to get addicted to that feeling of lightheadedness, because that means that you're plugged into the spirit world. That means you're plugged into the other world, and if you're plugged into the other world, you are far more likely to have accidents. People that are consistently plugged into the other world, they lack grounding for starters, but they're very clumsy, they're very airy, they're off with the fairies. And I did write a little bit about that in my grounding piece for you all. And so it's really, really important to ground and center, okay? They are not the same things. There is an order to them. Grounding, and then calling yourself into place. Afirmando esa cabeça. Afirma a sua cabeça. And bring it to the middle. And do the action if it helps, because I find that there can be a lot of mindfulness in creating action for yourself. For instance, I said I close my eyes. I call myself back. I place my hands in front of me. I feel my presence coming back. And it's the way of my hands, which I trust in my hands. I trust in the physicality. If I need to bring something to me, what is it that I do? I grab it and I bring it to me. I pick it up, I move it, I do things, and my physical body responds to that. So if I'm here calling my spirit back in a way, I mean, it just, like hairs, like goosebumps. Like I do, every time I do it, I'm just like, it's such an intrinsic action for me now. And it is so natural. And it just, look at it, it just happens. It just happens, and I'm constantly present, and now I can feel spirit around me. They're funny. My ancestors are funny. Sorry. My ancestors are a bit funny. So anyway, centering. Afirma sua cabeça. Now ground. And release those anchors into the ground. So practice these two simultaneously. So when you're presenting yourself for ritual, you ground and center. When you're disconnecting from ritual space, then you center, then ground. Okay, ground and center and ground. So it happens like this. Now, I wanted to sort of reach out to those who had practiced Reiki, for instance, and you would know that when you call the Reiki energy to you, that you open, you ground, you center, you call that Reiki energy. And then when you're finished practicing your Reiki, you have to knowingly disconnect. Otherwise, you remain tethered to the person, the thing, the animal, for instance, or the object if you're doing some kind of long distance type of Reiki. And acknowledging that necessity to untether yourself is then important, and this is that returning to that place of groundedness, mindfully disconnecting, centering, making sure that you feel that awareness of body, you feel intact, there's nothing residual, there's nothing left over, you're not plugged into anything, and then grounding so that you can return to the conscious now. So centering is extraordinarily important, and you cannot practice it without grounding. So you see how these are foundational practices? They are anything but boring, because they are the keys that open up doors to more detailed, more adept practices. You have to nail this stuff. You really do, before you can move on to spirit work, for instance. You have to have this stuff like nailed. The divination. You want to do divination? Ground and center. Mindfulness practices. You have to do that. In order to get really comfortable doing journeys, spiritual journeys, guided, visualized journeys, or actual spirit and soul journeys, you need to start practicing meditation. Because all of these are foundational practices that help you to get your mind in the game. And it's not just something that you do once. These are sustained practices, grounding, centering, mindfulness practices, meditation. They technically I hate to use the word should become part of your daily practice. And when we're looking at constructing a daily practice, which we will do towards the end of this sacred balance process, then when we can do that, when we can start to talk about our daily practices in a way, then we can start to really establish a routine. And by establishing a routine, you start to establish a habit, and you start to make witchcraft an integral part of your life. If you're on holiday, you're still going to do your daily practice. If you're sick, you're going to do your daily practice. It's going to look a little different, but you're going to do it. Your soul's going to do it for you, honestly. It's weird. Once you get into that process, into that habit of doing daily practice, then it just creates the most intense presence of witch in your life. It's there. Like, you're a witch. You do daily practice, and it's not hard. That's the idea. You're a witch because you practice witchcraft every damn day. Every single day. You're living and breathing your craft. And it all begins with grounding, centering, mindfulness, meditation. It begins with these so-called boring-esque practices. And it's easy to see how it could be misconstrued as boring because nobody ever explains it in an exciting way. But really, when you start to connect with the essence of these practices, you can then sort of sink your teeth into them and sort of make them your own. How you do these types of practices is up to you. There are many ways to ground, there are many ways to center, there are many ways to practice mindfulness, there are many ways to practice meditation. And so finding those ways that are effective for you, therein lies the greatest challenge, because it requires a good amount of experimenting. So once we can do that, once we get to that point where we're happy to experiment, then we start to bring that foundation into sharp relief, and we can really build upon that, okay? So it's really important for us to get through this subject as efficiently as possible with complete understanding of the material that's being offered, because it's important. It really is important, okay? It's like building a house, to use the most boring analogy. It's building a house. You have to have that slab, that foundation first. Then come the walls, then come the plumbing, then come the electricals, and all of that kind of business. It all takes shape in the same way. We're building something from scratch. And as we're building, we're calling back those fragments of ourselves. We're remembering what worked in past lives. We're remembering ancestral practices. It's very exciting. You are going to get so much out of grounding, centering, and mindfulness when you start to look at it as an integral part of the practice of a witch practitioner. Yes, right. There you have it, beautiful souls. Centering. Get comfortable with it. It's exciting. Much love, many blessings. Mwah! Bye.